The ancient world knew fortresses that seemed eternal, cities built not merely to shelter life, but to project dominion across continents. Their walls rose like mountains of human ambition, their gates sealed with metal and pride. These were not simple settlements. They were declarations written in stone and blood, monuments to power that believed itself unchallengeable. Yet every wall that claimed permanence would one day know silence. Every gate that boasted invincibility would eventually swing open to ruin. The Bible records these cities with surgical precision, not as myths whispered around campfires, but as historical realities that shaped the destiny of nations. Babylon, Nineveh, Jericho, Tyre, Hazor, each name carries weight across millennia. Each represents the pinnacle of ancient engineering, military strategy, and political control. These were command centers of empires, fortresses designed by the greatest minds of their age. They controlled trade routes, commanded armies, and held entire populations under their shadow. What made these cities truly formidable was not merely their physical defenses, it was their systematic approach to power. They centralized authority, accumulated wealth, and projected force with calculated efficiency. Their architecture reflected military doctrine. Their urban planning revealed strategic thinking that would influence warfare for centuries. These were not accidental achievements. They were deliberate constructions meant to endure against every conceivable threat. Yet beneath the confidence of their construction lay a profound vulnerability. These cities, for all their engineering brilliance and military might, could not guarantee their own survival. The very permanence they claimed would become their epitaph. Their ruins now speak a language their builders never intended. They tell stories not of invincibility, but of limitation, not of eternal dominance, but of inevitable collapse. This is not a tale of primitive settlements overcome by progress. This is an examination of civilization at its most advanced, at the moment of its greatest strength, facing forces that transcended military strategy and engineering prowess. These cities fell not because they were poorly built, but because power, however concentrated, however fortified, remains subject to laws beyond human control. Their stories demand attention. Their fates require understanding.
Before we start, I need your help. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing these hidden truths to light.
Mesopotamia birthed cities unlike any the world had known. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, human ambition found its purest expression in brick and bitumen. The very soil beneath these waters contained the materials for empire. Clay that could be shaped, fired, and stacked into walls that towered above the desert. Bitumen that sealed joints and repelled water. These were not mere building materials. They were the physical vocabulary of power. The engineers of ancient Mesopotamia understood something profound about defense. Height alone did not guarantee security. Thickness mattered. Redundancy mattered. They built walls within walls, creating concentric rings of fortification. If an enemy breached the outer defenses, they would face a second barrier, then a third. Each wall was wide enough for chariots to race along its top. These elevated platforms transformed defensive structures into highways for rapid troop deployment. But the sophistication went deeper than simple stacking of materials. These cities incorporated hydraulic engineering that would astound modern observers. Aqueducts channeled water from distant sources. Reservoirs stored supplies for months-long sieges. Underground channels connected different quarters of the city, allowing communication and movement even when surface streets became battlegrounds. The urban planning revealed minds that thought in terms of systems, not individual buildings. Gates represented the most critical vulnerability in any fortification. The ancient engineers knew this. They reinforced gate structures with bronze and iron, creating choke points that could be defended by minimal forces against overwhelming numbers. Gates were recessed deep into the walls, creating killing zones where attackers would be exposed to projectiles from multiple angles. Some gates included false entrances that led to dead ends, traps designed to capture and eliminate advanced forces. The psychological dimension of these fortifications cannot be understated. When foreign delegations approached these cities, they encountered walls that seemed to merge with the sky itself. The message was unmistakable. This city possessed resources beyond measure. This city commanded expertise beyond challenge. This city would endure beyond memory. The architecture itself was propaganda, speaking a language of dominance that required no translation. Babylon did not merely exist in Mesopotamia, it defined what Mesopotamia meant. The city occupied strategic geography that controlled river traffic, agricultural surplus, and military movement across the entire region. From this single urban center, decisions radiated outward that determined the fate of nations. Kings ruled here, armies assembled here, wealth accumulated here. Babylon was not just a capital, it was the concept of centralized power made manifest in stone. The scale of Babylon exceeded comprehension. Population estimates suggest hundreds of thousands lived within its walls, a concentration of humanity unmatched in the ancient world. This density required sophisticated administration, food distribution systems, sanitation infrastructure, law enforcement. The city functioned as a living organism, with specialized districts performing specific functions. Administrative quarters, military barracks, religious precincts, commercial zones. Each component contributed to the whole. Biblical texts describe Babylon with particular attention to its presumption. Here was power that believed itself self-sufficient, authority that recognized no higher jurisdiction. The city represented the ultimate expression of human capability, organized toward dominion. Its rulers spoke as though their decrees carried eternal weight. Its priests conducted rituals that claimed cosmic significance. Its merchants traded as though the routes they controlled would flow forever. Yet Babylon's foundation rested on a legacy of interruption. Centuries before the empire reached its zenith, the same plain of Shinar witnessed humanity's first great architectural project. The Tower of Babel rose with identical materials, brick and bitumen, driven by identical motivations. Unity without God, height without humility, power without acknowledgement of higher authority. That project ended not in completion, but in confusion, scattered by divine intervention that fractured human language itself. The imperial Babylon that rose later carried this shadow in its foundation. It built upon ground that had already known supernatural interruption. The city's engineers used the same techniques, the same materials, the same strategic thinking as their ancient predecessors. But they built in defiance of memory, as though previous failure contained no lesson. Babylon's grandeur became inseparable from its arrogance, its magnificence indistinguishable from its presumption. The double walls of Babylon represented defensive thinking at its most paranoid and most brilliant. The outer wall stood thick enough that chariots could race along its crown. Behind it, separated by a measured distance, rose an inner wall of similar construction. Between them lay a killing zone, a space where any force that breached the first barrier would find itself trapped, exposed, and vulnerable to counterattack from elevated positions on both sides. Watchtowers punctuated these walls at regular intervals, creating overlapping fields of observation. No approach could be concealed, no movement escaped notice. Guards rotated in shifts that maintained constant vigilance. Signal systems allowed rapid communication along the entire perimeter. If one section came under attack, reinforcements could be deployed within minutes. The walls were not passive barriers. They were active defensive systems, manned by professional soldiers who trained specifically for siege warfare. But Babylon's engineering ambitions transcended military necessity. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed as described, represented a different kind of power projection. These were terraced structures rising high above the city, supporting full-grown trees and elaborate vegetation in an environment naturally hostile to such growth. Water had to be lifted from the Euphrates through mechanical systems, distributed through channels carved into stone platforms, maintained at precise levels to sustain life at unnatural heights. The technical challenges involved staggers the imagination. Weight distribution across elevated platforms, waterproofing to prevent root damage and structural decay, hydraulic lifting mechanisms capable of continuous operation. The gardens were not merely beautiful, they were statements of technical mastery, demonstrations that Babylonian engineering could defeat nature itself, could create paradise through force of will and sophistication of method. Every major structure in Babylon communicated the same message through different means. The city did not simply defend itself, it proclaimed supremacy. It declared that human organization, properly directed and adequately resourced, could achieve any objective. The buildings were arguments made in brick. The irrigation systems were theorems proven through application. Babylon existed as physical evidence that power, when sufficiently concentrated, could reshape reality according to its own design. Babylon's confidence was not misplaced by the standards of its time. The city had withstood attacks before. Its walls had turned back armies. Its reserves had outlasted sieges. Military analysts studying the city's defenses would have concluded that conventional assault was futile. The fortifications were simply too strong, too deep, too well-manned. Any attacking force would exhaust itself long before breaching the inner city. The Medo-Persian strategy bypassed conventional military thinking entirely. They studied not the walls, but the river. The Euphrates flowed through Babylon, passing beneath the fortifications through channels that the city's engineers had never considered vulnerable. Water was life. The river was necessity. The channels were therefore left open, protected by their very function. Who would imagine an army approaching through water? The Persian engineers worked upstream, far from Babylon's sight. They excavated channels, constructed temporary dams, redirected the flow of the Euphrates itself. The river that had sustained Babylon for centuries became the instrument of its defeat. As water levels dropped, the channels beneath the walls transformed from barriers into passages. What the city had built for its own supply became the pathway for its enemies. The Book of Daniel records that night with stark clarity. Inside the palace, Babylon's elite celebrated. Wine flowed, music played. The king hosted a feast that demonstrated abundance and security. Outside those walls, the city functioned normally. Guards maintained their posts. Citizens slept in their homes. Trade goods sat in warehouses awaiting morning distribution. Nothing suggested catastrophe. Nothing indicated the end of an era. But beneath the celebration and routine, Persian soldiers waded through the lowered river. They moved through channels that should have been impassable, entering the city through openings that should have been defended by the water itself. The infiltration was not dramatic, it was methodical. Section by section, the Persians established positions inside Babylon's supposedly impregnable defenses. By the time the city realized what was happening, resistance had become futile. The fall itself was almost anticlimactic. No prolonged siege, no heroic last stand, no gradual wearing down of defenses. The city that symbolized permanent power simply ceased to exist as an independent entity that same night. The transition from dominance to subjugation occurred in hours. All the engineering, all the military preparation, all the accumulated strength proved irrelevant against an approach that exploited not weakness, but assumption. Babylon's defeat revealed something profound about fortification. The strongest point in any defense is only as secure as its weakest assumption. The city had built walls to stop armies, but had not imagined enemies who would not attack the walls. It had concentrated force at obvious points of vulnerability, while leaving unconsidered approaches unguarded. Strength itself had created a form of blindness. Confidence had bred a failure of imagination that proved fatal. After conquest, Babylon did not disappear immediately. The Persians used it as an administrative center. Alexander the Great later claimed it as a capital. The physical structures remained largely intact for generations, but something fundamental had changed. The city was no longer the source of its own authority. It had become a tool wielded by others, a convenient location rather than a center of power. This transition marked a different kind of destruction than physical demolition. Babylon's population gradually dispersed as political importance shifted elsewhere. Trade routes were redirected to favor new capitals. Administrative functions migrated to cities that better served new empires. The infrastructure that had sustained metropolitan life began to decay through simple neglect. Wells went unmaintained, aqueducts cracked, streets degraded. No single catastrophe caused this decline. It was death by irrelevance. The bricks that had built Babylon's grandeur became resources for other projects. Builders in surrounding regions dismantled structures, hauling away materials to construct new cities. What had been monuments became quarries. What had been temples became sources of pre-cut stone. The city was not destroyed in fury. It was recycled with complete indifference. This casual erasure proved more thorough than any military assault could have achieved. Centuries passed. The ruins were covered by wind-blown sand and accumulated debris. The once great city became a landscape feature, a series of irregular mounds that gave no hint of former glory. Local populations built villages using fragments they found. unaware they were living atop what had been the center of the ancient world. Memory itself faded. Babylon transformed from history into legend, from fact into myth. When archaeologists finally excavated the site in modern times, they found exactly what the biblical texts had described and predicted: massive walls reduced to foundations, palace complexes identifiable only through ground-penetrating surveys. The scale was evident, but the magnificence was gone. Babylon had become an object of study, a source of artifacts for museums, a site that required interpretation for visitors to understand what they were seeing. The city that had dominated nations now required explanation to be comprehended. Assyrian power rested on systematic brutality. Nineveh was not merely a capital. It was the command center for a military apparatus designed to generate and maintain fear across an empire. The city's wealth came not from trade or innovation, but from conquest and tribute. Subject peoples sent treasure to avoid destruction. Rebellious provinces received punishment so severe it served as warning to others. This was not governance. It was organized intimidation operating at imperial scale. The Assyrian military machine functioned with terrifying efficiency. Armies could be mobilized rapidly, transported along well-maintained roads, supplied through sophisticated logistics networks. They employed siege technology that could reduce fortified cities to rubble. They practiced psychological warfare, leaving survivors of conquered cities to spread tales of horror that would soften resistance elsewhere. Nineveh coordinated all of this from a central location, processing intelligence, dispatching forces, absorbing the wealth that flowed back. The city itself reflected this martial character. Palace walls were covered with carved reliefs depicting battles in graphic detail. Prisoners being executed, cities being burned, tribute being delivered. These were not merely decorative. They were educational materials for foreign dignitaries, visual lessons about the consequences of resistance. Walking through Nineveh's royal districts meant confronting image after image of Assyrian dominance and enemy suffering. Military infrastructure dominated the urban landscape. Barracks housed standing forces ready for immediate deployment. Armories stored weapons in quantities sufficient to equip armies. Training grounds occupied significant portions of the city. Administrative buildings managed the complex logistics of perpetual warfare. Nineveh was not a city that happened to have an army. It was an army that happened to have built a city around itself. Yet this concentration of military power created its own vulnerabilities. A system organized entirely around conquest and control possessed no flexibility when circumstances changed. Every resource had been optimized for a single purpose. Every structure served military objectives. When that military purpose failed, when the armies that projected power were themselves defeated, nothing remained to sustain the city. Nineveh had built itself into a machine with no purpose beyond war, and machines cannot adapt when their function becomes obsolete. The coalition that assembled against Nineveh represented accumulated rage from decades of subjugation. Babylonians, Medes, and other peoples who had suffered under Assyrian dominance united with a single purpose: the complete destruction of their oppressor's capital. This was not a campaign for territory or tribute. This was retribution seeking permanent solution. They came not to conquer Nineveh, but to erase it. The siege tested the city's famous defenses. Nineveh's walls were massive, constructed with materials meant to endure millennia. Watchtowers provided clear sightlines across every approach. Defenders could rain projectiles on attackers from protected positions. The city's water systems allowed it to sustain siege conditions indefinitely. By every military calculation of the era, Nineveh should have been able to hold out until the coalition exhausted itself and withdrew. But the Tigris River, which had always been a source of security and supply, became a weapon against the city. Historical accounts suggest flooding, possibly from seasonal rains, possibly from deliberate engineering by the attackers. Water undermined foundations. Sections of wall collapsed. The very defenses that had seemed impregnable developed breaches that could not be quickly repaired. Suddenly, the fortress had openings, and the coalition poured through. What followed was not battle but annihilation. The attackers showed no mercy, extended no quarter. They killed systematically. They burned deliberately. They destroyed with purpose. The palace complexes were set ablaze, their timber roofs and internal structures consumed in fires hot enough to crack stone. Administrative buildings were demolished. The infrastructure of imperial power was methodically dismantled. This was not the chaos of conquest. This was planned elimination. The Book of Nahum had prophesied this destruction with startling specificity. The prophet described Nineveh as already fallen, using past tense for future events, writing of fire, flooding, and complete devastation. The biblical text showed no sympathy, no regret. Nineveh had built its power on the suffering of others, and its end was described as justice manifest. When the prophecy became history, the details aligned with unsettling precision. The city that had terrified nations experienced terror itself and found no deliverance. After Nineveh fell, it did not simply decline like Babylon, it vanished. The destruction was so complete, the abandonment so total, that within a few generations the city's exact location became uncertain. Travelers passed through the region seeing only mounds of earth, irregular hills that looked natural rather than architectural. The command center of the world's most feared empire had been erased so thoroughly that it became a geographical mystery. This disappearance was itself a form of judgment. Cities that decline slowly leave traditions, cultural continuity, some thread connecting past to present. But Nineveh experienced rupture so absolute that even memory fragmented. Stories persisted, biblical references remained, but concrete knowledge of the city's location faded into scholarly debate. The place that had broadcast its power through carved stone and military might become a question mark on ancient maps. For centuries, skeptics pointed to this absence as evidence against biblical accuracy. If Nineveh had been as significant as Scripture claimed, surely some trace would remain visible. If the city had dominated an empire, surely local tradition would preserve its location. The silence seemed to support those who read biblical accounts as exaggeration or metaphor. The very completeness of Nineveh's destruction became an argument against its historical reality. Then modern archaeology began excavating the mounds near Mosul. Beneath meters of accumulated earth, they found exactly what the biblical texts had described: massive wall foundations, palace complexes with relief carvings depicting the scenes Scripture referenced, administrative buildings, military installations. The scale matched ancient descriptions. The character aligned with biblical accounts. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. What emerged from those excavations was not just architectural remains, but vindication of textual accuracy. The prophets had described Nineveh's power, predicted its fall, and specified the nature of its destruction. Centuries later, archaeological science confirmed these accounts with physical evidence that could be measured, photographed, and analyzed. The city that had disappeared so completely that its existence was doubted now stood as testimony to the precision of biblical historical record. Jericho occupied geography that transformed it from settlement into strategic necessity. Located in the Jordan Valley, it controlled access routes into Canaan's interior. Any force seeking to penetrate the region from the east would encounter Jericho first. This was not incidental positioning. This was deliberate military geography. The city existed to block invasion, to serve as the first and most formidable barrier against eastern threats. The power of Jericho lay not in expansion, but in denial. It did not need to project force across territories or command vassal cities. Its function was simpler and more critical: prevent passage. An army that could not take Jericho could not advance into Canaan. A force that exhausted itself against Jericho's defenses would be too weakened to continue, even if it eventually succeeded. The city was a strategic choke point, and it had been engineered specifically for that purpose. Archaeological evidence reveals defensive architecture sophisticated beyond what its size would suggest. Multiple walls created layered defense. The outer walls rose from a steep earthen rampart, making approach difficult and scaling nearly impossible. Behind this, additional walls provided fallback positions. The construction used stone foundations with mud brick superstructures, materials that absorbed impacts better than pure stone. Gates were recessed, creating killing zones where defenders held every advantage. The urban layout inside these defenses showed a population that lived under perpetual martial posture. Structures were compact, streets narrow, open spaces minimal. This was not aesthetic choice, but military necessity. Dense construction made internal movement by attackers difficult, even if they breached the outer defenses. Every building could potentially serve as a defensive position. The entire city functioned as a three-dimensional fortification where conventional military advantage would be neutralized. When Israel approached, Jericho sealed itself completely. The biblical text is explicit about this. Gates locked, walls manned. The city transformed into pure fortress, offering no diplomacy, accepting no negotiation. From Jericho's perspective, this was rational strategy. Their defenses had been tested before. They knew their walls could withstand siege engines and assault tactics. They believed their position was unassailable. They were wrong in ways they could not have imagined. The strategy God commanded made no military sense. March around the city once daily for 6 days. On the 7th day, march 7 times. Then have priests blow trumpets while the people shout. No siege engines, no assault ladders, no undermining of foundations, no conventional warfare at all. By every standard of ancient military doctrine, this was not strategy. It was ritual. It was theater. It was inexplicable. Yet this inexplicability was precisely the point. Israel did not take Jericho through superior tactics or overwhelming force. They did not breach the walls through engineering skill or military innovation. The conquest was not a demonstration of human capability, but of divine intervention. The walls fell not because they were poorly built, but because God willed their collapse. The victory was credited explicitly to the Lord, removing any possibility of human boasting. The mechanics of the collapse remain mysterious. The biblical text does not explain the physical process, only the result. After the 7th circuit on the 7th day, after the trumpet blast and the unified shout, the walls fell. Not gradually, not in one section at a time. The description suggests simultaneous complete structural failure across the entire perimeter. The fortification that should have been impregnable simply ceased to exist as a barrier. This supernatural intervention served multiple purposes. It demonstrated to Israel that their success depended not on military prowess, but on obedience to God. It showed Canaan's inhabitants that they faced an enemy backed by power beyond human comprehension. It established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the conquest. Victories achieved not through superior strategy, but through divine action. Jericho's fall was a theological statement made through architectural collapse. The site of ancient Jericho preserves evidence that continues to fuel archaeological debate. Layers of destruction exist in the ruins. Walls show signs of collapse, but dating these layers and correlating them with biblical chronology remains contentious. What cannot be disputed is the city's ancient importance, its sophisticated defenses, and the fact that it did experience violent destruction. The physical evidence confirms that something catastrophic happened to this fortress, even as scholars debate the precise timing and mechanism. Tyre represented a completely different paradigm of power. While inland cities relied on thick walls and large armies, Tyre's strength came from water itself. The city was divided between a coastal settlement and an island fortress located 800 meters offshore. This maritime component made Tyre virtually unconquerable by conventional land armies. They could destroy the coastal city, but the island remained untouchable, supplied and defended by the Phoenician fleet. The Phoenicians were not warriors in the Assyrian or Babylonian sense. They were traders, sailors, builders of ships rather than siege engines. But this commercial orientation created its own form of power. Tyre controlled Mediterranean trade routes. Their ships carried tin from distant lands, cedar from Lebanon's mountains, purple dye that commanded extraordinary prices. Wealth flowed into Tyre from 3 continents, making the city rich beyond measure without requiring territorial conquest. This wealth funded defenses appropriate to a maritime power. The island's walls rose directly from the sea, constructed to withstand both naval assault and storm surge. Harbors were engineered with precision, featuring breakwaters and controlled entrances that protected ships while limiting enemy access. Watchtowers provided clear sightlines across approaching waters. The city could see threats coming from kilometers away and had time to prepare responses. Psychologically, Tyre's position bred a particular kind of confidence. The sea was not merely defensive barrier, but source of prosperity. Trade routes brought constant information about the wider world. Phoenician colonies dotted Mediterranean coasts, extending Tyre's influence without military occupation. The city saw itself as invulnerable, not through strength of arms, but through strategic positioning and naval supremacy. They believed the sea itself guaranteed their independence. The prophet Ezekiel delivered a pronouncement against Tyre that seemed to understand this confidence and predict its undoing. He described the city's stones, timber, and dust being thrown into the sea. He prophesied that Tyre would become a bare rock, a place where fishermen would spread their nets. These were oddly specific predictions. They described not just defeat, but a particular method of destruction that seemed implausible for an island fortress. Yet centuries later, these improbable details would align with historical events in ways that defy coincidence. Alexander the Great approached Tyre with an army that had conquered cities across Asia Minor. But the island fortress presented a problem he had not encountered before. His siege engines were useless without solid ground. His infantry could not swim while carrying armor and weapons. His tactical genius meant nothing if he could not bring force to bear against the enemy. Tyre seemed to mock him from across 800 meters of water. The solution Alexander devised was audacious to the point of madness. He would build a causeway, a land bridge connecting the mainland to the island. This was not merely ambitious engineering, it was a fundamental alteration of geography. He would eliminate Tyre's defensive advantage by physically connecting the island to the continent. He would transform a naval problem into a conventional siege through brute force application of labor and material. The construction required exactly what Ezekiel had prophesied centuries earlier: the stones, timber, and rubble of the mainland city thrown into the sea. Alexander's engineers demolished the coastal settlement systematically, using its materials to build the causeway. Foundation stones were dropped into the water. Timber frames created structures that could be filled with debris. Gradually, laboriously, the causeway extended toward the island. What had been prophecy became construction technique. Tyre's defenders attacked the causeway repeatedly. They sent fire ships to burn the wooden components. They harassed workers with projectiles. They attempted to destroy sections under construction. But Alexander's resources proved inexhaustible. Every setback was met with renewed effort. The causeway grew wider, stronger, more resilient. What had seemed impossible slowly became inevitable as months of labor transformed sea into land. When the causeway finally reached the island, Tyre's advantage evaporated. Alexander could deploy siege engines. He could mass troops for assault. The walls that had seemed impregnable from the sea became conventional fortifications that could be attacked with conventional methods. The city that had believed itself protected by water discovered that even the sea could be conquered by sufficient determination and engineering skill. The fortress fell not because its defenses were weak, but because its fundamental defensive premise had been eliminated. Hazor dominated northern Canaan not through isolation, but through coordination. The city functioned as a regional capital, exercising authority over smaller settlements scattered across the territory. When Hazor's king issued commands, other Canaanite rulers responded. When Hazor mobilized forces, coalition armies assembled. This was not the centralized empire of Babylon or Assyria, but it represented effective political and military organization at a regional scale. The city's physical structure reflected this leadership role. Hazor was massive by Canaanite standards, divided into an upper fortified area and a large lower city. This design allowed for significant population concentration while maintaining strong defensive positions. Archaeological excavations reveal sophisticated urban planning, organized streets, substantial buildings, evidence of administrative complexity. Hazor was not merely larger than surrounding cities. It was qualitatively different, operating at a higher level of organizational capability. When Israel began the conquest of Canaan, Hazor's king recognized the threat and responded by forming a coalition. Multiple Canaanite cities united under his leadership to face the invasion. This was rational strategy based on accurate threat assessment. Individual cities could be defeated in isolation, but a coordinated force might overwhelm the invaders. Hazor organized what should have been an effective defense, pooling resources and military strength from across the region. The coalition met Israel in battle and was decisively defeated. The biblical account attributes victory to divine intervention rather than tactical superiority. Israel's forces were not professional armies. They were recently freed slaves and desert wanderers facing established military powers fighting on familiar terrain. By conventional military analysis, Israel should have been crushed. Instead, the coalition was routed, its armies scattered, its confidence shattered. What happened to Hazor after this defeat distinguished it from other conquered cities. Most Canaanite cities were occupied rather than destroyed, their infrastructure preserved for Israelite use. But Hazor was burned completely. The city that had coordinated resistance was eliminated as a functional entity. This was not random destruction, but strategic decision. Hazor's leadership role made it dangerous even in defeat. Only by destroying it completely could Israel ensure that no future coalition would form around this center of power. The archaeological record at Hazor speaks with unusual clarity. Excavation layers show extensive fire damage, collapsed structures, and evidence of deliberate destruction rather than gradual decline. The stratigraphy indicates a catastrophic event, a moment when the city experienced sudden, violent termination. Dating these destruction layers remains subject to scholarly debate, but the fact of massive conflagration is undisputed. Something reduced this powerful city to ruins. This physical evidence aligns with biblical narrative in ways that make dismissal difficult. The text claims Hazor was burned. The archaeology shows burning. The text indicates a specific historical moment of destruction. The archaeology reveals a destruction layer. Critics may dispute chronology, but cannot deny correlation. The ruins testify to events that match scriptural description, regardless of how one interprets the theological implications. What makes Hazor particularly significant is its role in demonstrating the relationship between biblical text and historical reality. For skeptics, ancient scripture represents religious mythology, not reliable historical documentation. But Hazor's ruins challenge this dismissal. Here is a city mentioned specifically in biblical conquest accounts, identified clearly in geographical context, described as undergoing particular destruction, and the physical site confirms these details through material evidence that can be examined scientifically. The city never recovered its former significance. After the destruction, Hazor declined from regional capital to minor settlement. The power it once exercised dispersed permanently. The coordination it provided ceased to exist. Later inhabitants built smaller structures atop the ruins, unaware or unconcerned with the city's former grandeur. What had been the dominant force in northern Canaan became a footnote, known primarily through biblical reference and archaeological investigation. Today, Hazor stands as one of the most important archaeological sites in Israel. Ongoing excavations continue to reveal details about Canaanite urban life, military organization, and the reality of conquest described in biblical texts. The site does not prove or disprove theological claims, but it demonstrates conclusively that the biblical writers were recording actual events at real locations. Hazor existed, it was powerful, it was destroyed. These are facts established by evidence that can be examined by anyone willing to study the ruins. 5 cities, 5 examples of power concentrated, organized, and expressed through architecture and military might. Babylon with its double walls and hydraulic engineering, Nineveh with its martial culture and intimidation tactics, Jericho with its strategic position and layered defenses, Tyre with its island security and maritime dominance, Hazor with its regional coordination and sophisticated urban planning. Each represented the pinnacle of achievement in its particular context. Each seemed designed to endure indefinitely, yet none survived as centers of power, not because they were poorly constructed, but because power itself, however concentrated, remains subject to forces beyond human control. Their ruins speak not of primitive failure, but of fundamental limitation. The most brilliant military minds, the most sophisticated engineering, the most abundant resources, the most strategic positioning, all proved insufficient to guarantee permanence. Something beyond human calculation determined their ultimate fate. The biblical record presents these cities without nostalgia or celebration. They are documented with historical precision, their power acknowledged, their destruction recorded. But the text shows no surprise at their fall. Scripture operates from a framework where human authority, regardless of scale, remains contingent and temporary. Cities rise and fall not according to their military strength, but according to purposes beyond their understanding or control. Modern observers examining these ruins face a choice about interpretation. One can view them as evidence of civilization's fragility, random chance eliminating even the most powerful constructions. Or one can see them as demonstrations of an ordered universe where pride precedes destruction, where power that claims permanence invites humbling, where forces exist that transcend human planning and engineering. The ruins themselves do not compel either conclusion, but they do demand acknowledgement that something beyond human expectation determined these outcomes. These cities remain instructive precisely because they were not weak. They were not poorly planned. They were not lacking in resources or determination. They represented human capability at its most developed, facing limitations that capability could not overcome. Their stories continue across millennia because they address questions that remain relevant. What makes power sustainable? What guarantees security? What determines which civilizations endure and which become archaeological curiosities? The ruins of Babylon, Nineveh, Jericho, Tyre, and Hazor offer no simple answers, but they compel serious engagement with questions that transcend any particular era or empire.